Good day, wondrous ones. I hope everyone can hear me. It's a beautiful morning here in Costa Rica in my país. Drinking my celery juice, keeping me nice and wild. So today I wanted to talk about, I just literally woke up and had this topic sort of just pop into my heart this morning as I was listening to some Jethro Tull, some 1970s Dionysian rock music. And I'm sort of in a very prep stage to run my Kings of the Heart online men's training in March. I'm just like dabbling every now and again into some of my notes, and I was reading my book, Healing Masculinity, this ebook that I sent out that's free. If you want it, send me a private message, I can send it to you. And I was thinking about this concept of the wild man, and maybe it's because we're about to go into the grand Pluto in Aquarius transit that starts on the 20th of January, and Pluto's going to come into Aquarius for the next 20 years. Lord of the underworld, transform or die energy. It's only going to drift back into a retrograde into Capricorn, I think, in November. But pretty much for the next 20 years, we're going to be doing some deep shadow work. And this is necessary shadow work to sort of clean us out before we get into more of emboldening and fulfilling the destiny of the age of Aquarius, which is many things. But one of the things is to restore the divine sense of our humanity, to come into unity consciousness, to use technology nobly. But of course, we're going to be seeing a lot of shadow work in the next 20 years. And I woke up today feeling like, you know what, I'm going to call a few things in the next little while. Not call out. I don't believe in cancel culture or criticizing things in a callous way, because, hey, we're all imperfectly perfect. Truth takes teamwork. I don't have the absolute truth. None of us do. But it's important that we have these feedback loops where we send out constructive criticism of ideas and such. If anything, I believe one of the most important things we need to be doing right now is examining our beliefs so that we can get really clear on what is the foundation that is then expressing our creativity in the world, particularly things like technology and AI and the transhumanism that is kind of a hangover, a fallout of fundamentalist religious ideas. Which is very much, the soil from which a lot of this technology is sprouting from, and that's why we're seeing a lot of sociopathy and potential psychopathy. We are really reeling with our collective insanity right now. So, in lieu of all of that, there's this whole vogueness of polarity teachings right now, and I know it's been very helpful for a lot of people. I've followed polarity teachings a lot since I discovered the work of David Deida and the Way of the Superior Man, and he introduced those into my life, and I embodied them in some of my relationships and saw firsthand how powerful it can be when, particularly in a dynamic between men and women, but it can be with any gendered partnership, when one creates this magnet between one partner really exuding the masculine and one exuding the feminine. It can create this beautiful chemistry, this beautiful magnetism. But the issues I've had with polarity teachings is a lot of them get very, rigid, and they start to make these overgeneralizations, and they start to kind of fit men and women into these boxes, these categories that I find personally very suppressive. And I've also been doing men's work for, over 10 years now. And I've seen there's this kind of new men's work idea of sort of men, being in this kind of dominant alpha male-ness, and that women have to be submissive to men, and women want to be submissive to men and want to be led by men. And there's a part of that I just find incredibly detestable, to be honest, especially for anyone who has delved into the ancient wisdoms of the goddess cultures that used to pervade most of the world, especially Eurasia. You find, the high priestesses, the crones, these elder women, the witches, literally a witch mean a woman who has her wits about her, who were great leaders, who men were submissive to, because women were seen to be more cyclical in nature, following very intimately the cycles of the moon. They were very much more capable to be emotionally intelligent, and they were much more bonded to nature, whereas men had this sort of vulnerability to kind of fly off and be flying boys, as Robert Bly would say, because we don't have, pregnancy, we don't have, this bleeding period each month where we're really bonded to the earth. And patriarchy really just accentuated that and really made this monstrous like schism between men and women, but also internally between the masculine and feminine. And in some ways I'm seeing in this latest vogueness among men's work, these men going to the gym and being super disciplined and waking up in the morning at 4 and making all this money and like getting back to traditional values and cutting your hair and doing all this stuff. Like part of it's just like, I'm going to call it in. I think part of the problem is we're seeing now with social media, a lot of youthful intelligences are being platformed far too early before they've really matured into ideas, before they've actually had teachers. And, I say this to a lot of young people, and because it was said to me, in my late 20s, when I first started doing spiritual talks, I had an older male mentor who was kind of like, are you sure you have stuff to share at this point? And I kind of brashly was like, of course I do. I'm filled with all this like knowledge. And to be honest, I didn't. And my first few talks were absolutely disasters. And nowadays with social media, you find people in their early 20s, even the late teenage years, jumping in, labeling themselves this or that, and actually skipping a lot of steps of maturation. And I think that's why there's a lot of very diluted teachings out there, a lot of like missing the mark, inaccurate teachings. There's just a very immature energy that's exposed a lot in social media, because a lot of the more mature teachers and such, they're not so savvy on social media either. So just a notion to put out there. But there's many more things at play. One of them is this archetype of the wild man, which to me is kind of like the Joker card that throws a lot of the polarity teachings into, a bit of disarray. Because the wild man is probably the most persecuted aspect of our humanity in men and women, but particularly I'm speaking about in men here. When you look at the ancient depictions of the wild man, I'm thinking of Pan, the horned god who was centaur, half man, half stag. Even earlier depiction in the Celtic teachings was he was called Cernunnos. And you may have heard, if you've been to some of my live concerts, I have this song that I've written called Ode to Cernunnos. And of course, Cernunnos, or Pan, who was the god of nature, the god of virility, the god of fertility, the god of nature, the green man who would make love to Mother Earth on May Day, on Beltane, on the spring, to bring forth the blossom of her flowers and her crops. The wild man became so heavily persecuted that he became the devil in Christian teachings, this horned demonic entity. That's how fucking distorted the wild man has been, and that's something to really, really bear in mind. Now, another great parallel to the wild man is this idea of the Greek god Dionysus. Dionysus was also the wild man, and Dionysus was this character, this quality archetypally in the Greek pantheon. He was truly this wild character who would have these kind of orgies, and orgies meant actually celebrations and rituals where they would raise this orgiastic energy. It didn't necessarily mean like licentious sexual parties. It could be ecstatic dancing, the drinking of wine. Dionysus was, to have these parties where they would drink wine, and he'd have all these beautiful women, and he had long hair, and he was kind of effeminate looking. He was kind of this like blend of the masculine and feminine. What Dionysus really represented was the wild man is that part of us who is wholly initiated into the feminine, that part of us that is married, that has that inner marriage fulfilled between the masculine and the feminine within us. And so these are men who can sort of go back and forth between the masculine and the feminine very fluidly. And of course, right now, in a lot of this polarity teachings, you see this kind of resistance to this, that men need to be men, and this whole uber paranoia about the transgenderism thing. And now I have my own, thoughts on all of that. But transgenderism is actually also, there's an inner thing that's being taught here, and that is that truly the human soul is a hermaphrodite, that there is this inner marriage between the masculine and the feminine that needs to take place. And the wild man was this being who exuded in the archetype in men, someone who has really got in touch with their feminine. And the feminine, again, in a lot of polarity teachings, I see this idea of the feminine being soft, submissive, tender, but actually the feminine is that part of us that's willing to go into the underworld, as women do when they bleed once a month. They go deep into this emotional process where they're going into the underworld to face a very psychic ordeal. And that's why women need to be really, really supported during those times. So the wild man in men is a man who has such an honoring of nature that if he's in a partnership with a woman, he'll go with her into that willingly, support her, attend and witness the teachings that she brings forth as well. So he starts to spiral with her and become cyclical in nature as well, which is very, very profound. And this is why the wild man is a man who has really got in touch with his wounds, because wildness also means a state of liberation. And someone who is still in touch with their wounds is going to be socially kind of inept in a way. They're going to be kind of tense. They're not going to be able to lose themselves, for example, to dance. They're not going to be able to be in flow states, in free flow, spontaneously into choices, into experiences, whereas the wild man can. Now, we saw the wild man being activated immensely in the 1960s. You saw the flower power, right? This anointing of men start to grow their hair long, playing psychedelic rock music, working with psychedelic medicines. A lot of this was a pushback against the 50s, which we're almost seeing this play out again right now, where you have this kind of 1950s rigid traditional gender teachings coming forward, and the wild man is sort of returning in a way to break free from that. We saw that in the 1960s, and we also saw that in my generation in the grunge rock era of the 1990s. Nirvana, Kurt Cobain in particular was very Dionysian. And I remember watching one of my favorite. There was a documentary right after Kurt Cobain died, Live Tonight Sold Out, that came out about Nirvana, and I was so captivated by watching this documentary, and you should really, I feel I should really watch it again, because I'm sure I'd have new eyes on it after all the archetypal studies that I've been doing. But Kurt Cobain really exuded this wild man. There was one particular depiction where he was playing on a British daily talk show, Nirvana was, and it was this nicely coiffed male host, short hair in a suit, and his set was actually a very mundane living room. It was hey, come into my house. I'm just this traditional man, father figure. And they cut to then Nirvana, and Nirvana were topsy-turvy. They were dressed all in dresses, totally in touch with their feminine. And they played, one of their savage 3-minute, absolutely Kali-esque destructive punk rock songs. And then they absolutely destroyed not only their instruments, but they destroyed the set. It was really, really powerful. And then when it flipped back to the host, that flipping back, you could just see this Dionysian explosion of tearing down this overly ordered world and then going back to this man. It's you could just see the bullshittery of this pretense environment, this totally overly controlled, reality TV show set. And so the wild man is not without a shadow. Of course, Kurt Cobain eventually died, committed suicide. He had lots of drug problems. This is also the problem of the wild man. And this is why in archetypal teachings, it's all about sacred balance. The word balance is pretty much the noble truth in almost all true, authentic spiritual traditions. You always have to balance things out. And that takes tremendous skill. It's much easier and lazy to just go into the wild man. And we've probably seen this within ourselves. I've seen it. There was a point in my life where I was doing shaking medicine and the wild man was very activated in me. And it was just all about being free all the time and just about me, being liberated and being this charismatic free person. But I ended up actually doing things that were, pissing people off and actually crossing boundaries and stuff like that. I was just totally unaware. I was just so in my spiritual ego. And we see this with the wild man. He becomes untethered. So you need to come back to things like the king archetype, which brings this like beautiful structure and order that's in touch with this transpersonal purpose. You need the warrior with that discipline. I would say the wild man is kind of a sprouting out of the lover archetype. And in the archetypal teachings, they say the lover archetype is actually the most dangerous because that energy of love, it just wants to love everything. It's amoral by nature. It's boundaryless. It just wants to be connected with the one. But we need to be balanced out, you know. And then, of course, you have the magician, shaman archetype as well that really knows the workings of all these inner mechanisms and how to really methodically create those balances inside. So, you know, this, when it comes to polarity teachings, and this is not to just, you know, criticize polarity teachings, but in general, the wild man has been so exiled from our culture that, of course, it's not really brought into a lot of these ideas, like the polarity teachings ideas, which are so pervasive now, so vogue. But it needs to be, because when I see the problems of the polarity teachings and this rigidity, this overgeneralizations of what man and woman should be, the wild man's as part of us that kind of like wholly foolishly likes to tickle all sense of order. It's kind of like that Hayoka teaching from the Native Americans. And I've worked with some people who identify as Hayoka in the Native American tradition, and they're so wonderfully accepted into those Native American circles because they realize, even in their protocols and their traditions, which are very tight. If you've ever worked with traditional indigenous people, they have very tight protocols. You know, you have to walk a certain way around the fire, you have to smudge this way, that. But then they'll have these people there who are contraries, as they call them, or Hayokas, who will, you know, tell a joke at a time when you think is like super awkward, and they're honored because they realize that even in all this tight order, there has to be this kind of little element of lassitude, this little looseness, so that, you know, that spontaneous energy of spirit can get in. And the wild man really brings that in to the polarity teachings as well. I think it's very important that that's brought in, because, you know, it's great that men are recovering what's beautiful about tradition, because there are some really beautiful traditional things. It's great that men are, you know, really starting to embody a strong sense of masculinity in a world that's actually denigrating the masculine deeply and virulently. But we don't want men to be, you know, returning to sort of this old school masculinity that's overly rigid, you know, where it's like, it's all about discipline. It's all about just being on this mission and being in this kind of dominant alpha energy. I think the true alpha male is something more diverse, more nuanced. And I think that really needs to be explored in men. And I think when we look at the 1960s and what was flowering there, there's a new octave of it happening now. And I want to end with a few quotes here by Robert Bly, who, his book, Iron John, I recommend to every man that I work with, because this book is, in my mind, like one of the Bibles of the masculine work. Robert Bly's book then spawned the whole King, Warrior, Magician, Lover tradition, the book by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette, the many books that they wrote, which I've been such an ardent student of, and that's my Kings of the Heart program is all based on that archetypal psychology that Jung initially catalyzed as well. So here's a quote by Robert Bly. "The wild man who has examined his wound resembles a Zen priest, a shaman, or a woodsman more than a savage." So I like this quote because often, and I fall victim to this too, when we think of wildness, we think of like absolutely losing control, being in this like wild kind of ecstatic state, which is, for me, part of it. There's definitely a part of that. And a man who's in touch with this wild man has no problem surrendering, being submissive to that natural energy, as the Cernunnos, Pan, the green man of the ancient cultures, was submissive to the great goddess. You know, he really served her. But the wild man is also that part of us who's very integrated with his feminine, and thus the feminine is that part of us that takes us into the underworld of our deep, very challenging emotional knots and traumas, and seeks to resolve them, seeks to process them, as women do once a month in their moon lodging. So this idea of a wild man more resembling a Zen priest or shaman, it's a man who's done that work, who's been humbled, who has that kind of quietude of someone who's really been through initiations. And there's another beautiful quote. Robert Bly, I just love what he writes. To receive initiation truly means to expand sideways into the glory of oaks, mountains, glaciers, horses, lions, grasses, waterfalls, deer. We need wilderness and extravagance. Whatever shuts a human being away from the waterfall and the tiger will kill him. There's a lot to unpack there. So initiation ceremonies are one of the great losses of modern culture. Men used to be initiated from boys into men. And hardly any men have gone through this experience. And this is why there's such an epidemic of mental health problems and just challenges in general with men, and why this whole men's work movement is so popular right now and so needed, because men need to be somehow initiated. Now, Jung did say, or Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette did say, I think rather masterfully, that even despite the loss of these initiations, life itself is always initiating you. So it's not like a complete loss. There's always challenges in life that are asking us to transform and be a better version of ourselves, to tap into our latent potentials. But I love this. To receive initiation truly means to expand sideways, because in more of these polarity teachings about a man being this like dominant alpha male, it's a lot about this vertical growth, becoming more powerful, becoming more rich, ascending up the social ranks. But really, when you get into the wildness and true initiation through, the natural way of these traditional cultures, it was really about expanding sideways, like expanding to be in touch and relationship with the earth, with nature, which I just adore that teaching. A few more from Robert Bly. Yes. So contact with the wild man requires a willingness to descend into the male psyche and accept what's dark down there, including the nourishing dark. This is very, very profound. So, in a lot of polarity teachings, and this is my own interpretation, I'm sure there are deeper polarity teachings out there. If I go back to David Data's work, which I referenced at the beginning, The Way of the Superior Man, I believe he has a handle on a very deep expression of polarity teachings. But this idea that we need in the men's work, we need to go into our wounds. We need to go into places where we might be all of a sudden not that semblance of we've got all of our shit together. We might have to unwind ourselves, howl to the moon, go into that pain, into that agony, where it might seem a little wild, a little chaotic for a time as we go through a process. But that is very nourishing, because what we're doing there is we're bringing back fragments of our soul that have been cut off in traumatic experiences. And I'll finish with this quote. Following the tracks of one's own wound through the forest and finding that it resembles the tracks of God. Oof, Iron John, Robert Bly. Definitely get that book. So I'm going to leave that here. And just wanted to drop some stuff about the wild man. If you want to learn more, I do have this ebook called Healing Masculinity. Just shoot me your email in the comments or send me a direct message. I'll send you the ebook. It's a really short PDF. And in March, I'll be once again leading my Kings of the Heart training for men in the archetypes. We'll touch on a lot of this kind of stuff. So wishing you all beauty, love, and wisdom. And just a few more days before Pluto goes into Aquarius. Get ready, y'all. This is going to be 20 years of deep, intense, and beautiful, nourishing shadow work to bring us into the true flowering of the Aquarian age, which is a restoration of our divine humanity. Sending love to you all. Feel free to share this with your friends, with those you love, if you feel connected. I just got a little thought. If anyone has any questions, I can hang on for a few more minutes. Let me know. Just got a little intuitive guide. You can watch me drinking some of my celery juice. This is keeping me nice and wild every morning. I do my celery juice. I do my juices here in Costa Rica. You are most welcome. Getting some beautiful thanks. All right, well, I'll leave it there, folks. Sending you all so much love. If you just dropped in here at the end, this will be reposted to my page, and you can watch the whole talk on the wild man. Yeah, thanks, Justice. What are my themes for 2024? Wildflower Elixirs asks. Well, if you go onto my Instagram feed, you'll see quite recently I posted over on my Substack, which you can find in my bio's link tree on Instagram. Every year I write a kind of what is my theme for 2024. And I wrote this beautiful article called My Theme is Devotional Allegiance. And just to quickly unpack that, what I'm seeing this year is we are witnessing the old world order collapsing before our eyes. And we're going to see a lot more of it collapse in the next 20 years during this Pluto transit. And what we need to be in allegiance to is what is the new world that we all wish to create as sovereign beings. Because we are truly being initiated into our sovereignty. And that transpersonal purpose, not just our own personal, I want to do this with my life, but that serving a higher version of the world, we need to wake up in the morning and have that in our prayers, have that North Star to be that in allegiance to something greater. I think that's going to activate a lot of our growth and a lot of our evolution. So that's one of the big themes I have. I think we'll also just see a lot more of the dark side of technology. And technology is this grand kind of metaphor for our creativity. And it's going to cause us to have to go deep into really finding our moral center, because we are wielding tremendous power right now. And as we saw with things like COVID and the whole vaccine trouble that's happening now, we're in a big challenge because these vaccines have caused a lot of damage. When the profit motive gets into a lot of our arts and our sciences, it can really, really distort things. So we really need to have better ethics and better morality as well. So I think that's going to be a huge theme moving forward too. Any other questions, comments before I peace out, y'all? All right, well, sending you all a lot of love. And yeah, we'll talk again soon. You're most welcome. All right, see you all later.